So welcome everyone. It's nice to see so many faces, so many familiar faces. Maybe I will simply say thank you everyone for joining, and I'll let you guys begin if that's okay.
Sounds good. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see my slides. Yeah? Okay, see some head nods. All right, so I'm just going to dive in. I'm really grateful for the invitation to talk with you guys about some of the work that I've been doing over the last number of years, thinking about how to transition merit from a one-on-one intervention into a group psychotherapy. So I'm really grateful and interested to hear what you guys think and what you have questions about and your feedback. I also really want to highlight that this group and the idea for this group and groundwork for this developed from work with Allison James and Paul back in Indianapolis many years ago. And then I had the opportunity to develop a group psychotherapy during my clinical psychology internship about 5 years ago, where I really tried to develop this idea further. We wrote a manual and since have had a few papers published on the group itself and how feasible and how to implement it. So part of why I mentioned this is I really want to make sure that due credit's given both to Allison and Paul in the initial concept and development of the group, but also to mention my email is here, ashley.martin@yale.edu. Please feel free to reach out if you have feedback or questions. If you have any interest in getting a copy of the manual or any of the papers, I'm more than happy to share any and all of the materials. So please do reach out. So thinking about what I wanted to talk about, as I mentioned, the group, which I affectionately call Merit Little G. And in order to really talk about the group, I want to start kind of back at the basics, just very, very briefly to think together about what metacognition is and merit. And I know I'm talking to the experts on merit, so I won't spend a lot of time describing it, but just to make sure that folks are on the same page. And for those of you who have practiced merit for many years, I want to remind everyone of what those core components and tenets are so we can think together about how do we transition that into a group format in a thoughtful way. And then I will share with you the structure that we've come up with of how to do that. And then I'll wrap up thinking about the feasibility, acceptability, and implementation of merit as a group. And then I'm going to hand it over to my brilliant colleague, Jackie Abate, to talk about the challenges that she has seen in the real world application of the group. And then with permission from some of the participants she's worked with, she'll share some samples of the writing. And then we'd like to get some thoughts and feedback from you guys about your thoughts on the writing and how it applies to the group. And then of course, we'll leave some time for discussion and questions at the end, but please feel free to let me know if you have questions as I'm moving through the presentation. And so just to kind of give us all the same frame, I like to think about psychosis more broadly and what our goals are that we're trying to intervene with merit and merit as a group. And thinking about how Bueller thought about psychosis really resonates, I think, thinking about psychosis as a life that's interrupted with a collapse in the ability to create complex ideas about oneself and others despite maintaining intact neurocognition. And as a result of this, the patient hardly knows how to orient him or herself either inwardly or outwardly. And a very intelligent patient needs hours of strenuous inner effort to find her own ego, even for a brief moment. And others have thought about schizophrenia and considered this same difficulty as this difficulty or struggle to integrate information into a complex sense of self and others. And we still think about it that way in many ways today, is this fragmentation of experience. And so metacognition describes the processes at work when people do just that, right? To integrate their experiences and form more complex ideas about themselves and others in the world, and that these disruptions or metacognitive deficits are a key feature in what we see with serious mental illness like schizophrenia and psychosis that results in a lot of the difficulties we see, like psychosocial dysfunction, altered first-person experience, negative symptoms, a lack of agency, poor insight, the list goes on here. Again, I bring us back to kind of the core basics, just so we can think together about what merit is and how to apply it in a group setting. And so it's an integrative, recovery-oriented, research-based practice for people regardless of illness severity, and targets metacognition as a capacity by targeting the 4 metacognitive functions, thinking about those MAC-A anchors, self-reflectivity, the mind of others, decentration, and mastery. Improvements occur along a continuum and with practice, and it promotes autonomy and self-directed recovery, where an individual makes personally acceptable sense of their challenges to decide how to manage them and direct their own course of recovery. And so, again, I won't harp on all of the research in this domain, but I want to remind us just of those core components so we can think about how do we translate this in a group. And so we want to remind you of those 4 kind of content, what's discussed in a session component, so focusing on someone's agenda, inserting the therapist's mind in the room, eliciting a narrative episode, eliciting the psychological problem as your client sees it. 2 process elements are how session is carried out, so reflecting on the therapeutic relationship and progress. And then the 2 overarching components of what merit is trying to facilitate is the stimulation and reflections about the self and others, mastery. So important to think about how to do this. I think we first need to think about why we want to do this. So why should we even consider a group psychotherapy? And so although merit has been shown to be efficacious as an individual intervention and largely with work by those of you on this call, there's a growing demand to move towards a more cost-effective approach. And group psychosocial interventions enable a greater number of people to have access to treatment at any given time. And so merit in a group format might also provide therapeutic interactions above and beyond those obtained from individual merit treatment. And I'll come back to this, but just to give you a small idea, but you get real-time peer feedback. And I'll circle back to this peer component. I don't think the importance of this can be highlighted enough. And also there's real-time interactions that can be moderated and processed with assistance from the group facilitator, instead of just hearing about someone's interactions with others through the lens of your client, which is important in and of itself, but also important information that maybe is different from a one-on-one intervention. And there's just some aspects then of a group intervention that may uniquely enhance the goals of merit-oriented intervention. So they might uniquely lend themselves to stimulating the mind of others, for example, and decentration. So Merit-G, the group-based merit intervention in a nutshell, targets the enhancement of metacognitive capacity in the same way as individual merit, but through the inclusion of a written narrative that is accompanied by a merit-oriented process discussion. And so, as I showed you, those 8 core elements of merit, as a reminder, it really leans into eliciting a narrative episode through the tool of writing as a way to get a narrative account from everyone in the group simultaneously, all at the same time, and then it's discussed with a merit slant. And before I show you and talk more about the group, I want to highlight again that this is the work of a team of people that I'm fortunate enough to share with you today, and that many folks on these papers have made unique contributions to this work. So I want to highlight this is really the work of many. Also, I want to direct you towards these 2 recent publications on the group, both in the Journal of Contemporary Psychotherapy, the guide for implementation, so kind of a how to apply it and some tips for troubleshooting that I'd be happy to talk about maybe during the discussion. And then also the Psychological Services publication. I'm going to share with you some of that data today, which is about the feasibility and acceptability of the group. So if you're interested, I direct you in those 2 recent publications. Paul and I also recently just wrapped up a book chapter of how to do the merit group specific to individuals with trauma. Also, if anyone is interested, I'd be happy maybe offline to talk more about that as well. So what is the structure of the group? What does merit look like? So it's typically done in a 45-minute group session, and starts with introduction. So we often start with very, very brief introductions, even folks' first names. because it's traditionally been done thus far, at least, as an open group. So you might have different people joining. And it also, to align with merit, steps away from the hierarchy, and you want to show that partnership. So everyone kind of introduces themselves, and then you want to collaboratively set ground rules. So these often involve things like writing quietly during the group, avoiding crosstalk, being respectful to others in the group, maintaining confidentiality, those kinds of things. But again, it's important to do this in a collaborative nature and really led by the participants. And then you want to very briefly describe the structure of the group so folks know what to expect. So I often would say something along the lines that you'll be writing quietly for 15 minutes, followed by about a half an hour discussion where you'll have the opportunity to read what you've written, describe what you've written, read part of what you've written, maybe not share anything, but to really let them know that it's up to them what to share. And that way they can really write freely without feeling pressure that they have to share what they've written. So I like to give people kind of that heads up. And then you'll introduce the writing prompt. And this is a really important piece of the group, is thinking about what to select for the writing prompt. So we'll talk a bit more about that. But what you'll typically say is that in as much detail as possible, describe X, Y, or Z, and we'll come back of what to fill in to those blanks. And if you have space where you're facilitating the group, I always recommend that you write it on the board or post it somewhere. So if someone forgets it, it's a reminder. If someone comes in late, it's less disruptive if they can see what you're writing about. And then you'll write quietly for 15 minutes. Some groups, as you'll hear from Jackie, have operated with 10 minutes, but I want to highlight that the data I'll show you today is all the folks who've written for 15 minutes. And when the topic is appropriate, and maybe Jackie can talk more to this, I always encourage the facilitators as well to participate in the writing. Again, with the caveat though, that participants might ask you then at the end what you've written about. So keeping that in mind, but it also helps model metacognition and think together about experience. Then you'll move towards a discussion for 30 minutes, roughly. And so you'll always let people know also that you have about 1 minute remaining in the writing, and then you'll move into the discussion. And the very end of session, again, consistent with merit, you will look for feedback. How was it to write today? Or how was our group today? Was the discussion what you expected? Was the feedback you heard today maybe what you expected or didn't expect, for example? So that's the overall structure, the merit group, that there's 7 components. But the 2 really big and important pieces are the writing prompt and the discussion. So I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about those elements more specifically. And so the writing prompt. So the writing prompt should be broad enough to include everyone in the group, but specific enough that it helps an individual think of a very personal or specific autobiographical memory. So it's really important that you give some thought to what you're selecting as the writing prompt. So again, broad enough to include everyone in the group, but specific enough that it helps someone think of a specific memory for them. So what might that look like? So here are some examples. So on the left, you'll see some topics that are encouraged for the group, and then topics on the right are topics that are probably too narrow or specific and should likely be avoided. So the instructions for a group are, like I mentioned, in as much detail as possible, describe X, Y, or Z. And so you might want to say, describe your first job. So something that hopefully is broad enough for everyone in the group, or can be modified with small tweaks. And what I mean by that is if someone's never worked, maybe you can ask them to write about a time that they volunteered, or maybe they did a chore when they were younger around the house, or a time that they joined the military. So if any of you are in a veterans hospital, maybe that is someone's first job. So you can tweak it in a way that it likely can apply for the majority of the group members. Something that might be too narrow or too specific might be in as much detail as possible. Describe a time when you worked at a large company. So that might just exclude people from writing and really have a hard time of thinking about what someone could write. So again, broad enough to include everyone, but specific enough that it helps someone think of a certain memory. So other examples that you might consider are things like describing a time you learned something new, you traveled or explored someplace new, you learned to drive, or you taught someone how to do something, a time that you maybe experienced loss or saying goodbye to someone. So this is not an exhaustive list. There's a longer list in the Merit group manual, but again, not exhaustive, but just some examples of topics that you might consider. And again, other things that are too narrow, asking someone to describe the last time they went salsa dancing, or they ate something vegan, or took a trip to Italy. These are things that might just exclude people from participating in the group. And really the goal is to elicit that narrative episode as you would an individual Merit, but simultaneously across everyone in the group at the same time. So that's the writing prompt. And then after the 15 minutes of writing, you want to move into the discussion, which is about 30 minutes. So it's the bulk of the 45-minute. So the discussion, like I said, is 30 minutes. And when you're first transitioning from writing to the discussion and you're letting people know, okay, let's transition, wrap up what you're writing, it's often good to start asking with questions about the writing process itself. And this should be brief, just a few minutes. So the bulk really is on the writing that the participants have done. But asking questions like, what was it like to write about this topic today? Or before we even get into hearing what people have written, I'm curious, what was it like today to actually sit and write about this? Did it go as you expected? And often participants share things like, I thought this would be really hard to write about, but once I started writing, I was surprised at how many details I remembered. Or I thought this would be easy to write about, and then I realized I really didn't have a good sense of what it was like for others, when in the room, when I got into this argument with my mom, for example. So it really helps to get them thinking about what was happening for them and what they expected in this writing exercise, and then how it would actually work for them. Then you give the opportunity for participants to read or share their writing or memory. And I also want to highlight that we've had participants join the writing group who actually were unable to write due to injury or disability, and they still were able to successfully participate in the group, where they sat quietly for the 15 minutes and thought about what they might share, and then they just described their narrative. So I do want to highlight that even if someone isn't able to physically write, they still could participate in the discussion and partake in the group. Then you want to move into that merit-oriented process discussion. So just like a one-on-one intervention, you want to be curious, and not for the sake of just collecting details, but because you're curious about what someone's experience was like, and helping to really understand, enrich the narrative, and invite group members to ask questions and think together. Share your reflections of what you're seeing in the room. Some examples I think about are often, it's really salient to someone what someone shares, and they offer their own experience, or maybe it makes them think about how they would have handled it, and offering that reflection to them can be important. And you want to consider the metacognitive capacity of the participants and respond accordingly, again, just as you would in a one-on-one merit intervention. And remember and implement those 8 elements of merit that we all do in any given session. So considering the agenda, inserting the therapist's mind, eliciting narrative episodes. So even though you've done that already, you might gain some insight that this is a pattern for someone. And they say, as I'm thinking about it, I've actually, this has unfolded like this for me before. And so you might gain additional narrative accounts. You can elicit the psychological problem, again, as your client sees it, reflect on that therapeutic relationship and progress as appropriate in a group setting, all with the goals to stimulate reflections about the self and others and mastery. And so I want to share with you some of the research in the time remaining on the feasibility and acceptability of the group. And this is from a recent publication where we studied 31 unique participants who all had serious mental illness, most a schizophrenia spectrum disorder, that were both on an inpatient and outpatient setting. And we called the group Creative Writing. And at the end of each group, we asked folks to complete a qualitative survey where we asked them, why did you attend group? What did you like and what did you dislike about the group? And to make it as easy as possible to complete the survey, we offered for each question a series of responses that they could check the boxes. So they could say they attended because they were curious, for example, or maybe they liked the writing exercise, or they disliked how long the group was, for example. They could just check it off. But for each question, we also offered other and the ability to write things in, which people certainly did as well. And then we had a total of 19 groups across the 2 facilities, and it was offered once a week on each unit. And on average, we had 4 participants per group. It ranged between 1 and 9. And this is something maybe we can return to in the discussion. But when it starts to approach 9 or 10, you have to start thinking about how to troubleshoot to accommodate that many people to share their writing. And there's some different strategies and tricks about how you could do that, but maybe 4 to 6, maybe 7 is really a great number for giving room to for everyone if they're interested in reading and sharing what they've written. But there are ways to accommodate larger groups as well. And in this sample, more than half the participants attended more than one group, with some attending up to 7 in the span of what the groups offered. And I should mention that in this data, this group was offered as adjunctive care to their treatment plans that were already running in both the inpatient and outpatient settings. So it was all an open group, and so folks had the ability to come and go as they thought was helpful. And so I want to share with you some of the data from the qualitative survey. And just to orient you, because I'll show you a series of different tables. It has the different items that we asked about, including other. And then it's broken into 2 sections. So after the very first group that they participated in, after the last group that they participated in, and then it's split between both the outpatient and inpatient participants, and then collapsed across all of them with all participants. And so I'm just going to focus on the all participants for the sake of clarity and time. But when we ask people, why did you come to group today? Most said, I thought writing would be helpful. These are rank ordered here based on the first group session. I was curious. I thought I might learn something. I like talking with other people about things, and it sounded fun. And after the last group session that people completed, and again, remember, people completed up to 7 groups, it largely looked pretty similar. I thought writing would be helpful. I thought I would learn something, or I might learn something. And I like talking about things with other people. And so it sounded like it stayed somewhat consistent, but important that people thought writing would be helpful and they might get something out of it. And it was nice to talk with others about it. When we asked what they liked about group, largely at the beginning and after their last group session, people said, I enjoyed writing. They also endorsed enjoying the discussion and that it was interesting to hear other people's perspectives in writing. And I want to highlight also after the last group session as well, people said writing was helpful to organize my thoughts. And so we're kind of getting this message that they enjoyed the writing exercise, the discussion, and there was something helpful about the writing and organizing their mind. And when we asked participants, what did you dislike about the group? By and large, folks at the beginning and the end said nothing. Some said it was too short, both at the beginning and after their last group. I also want to highlight that people endorsed, I did not get enough time to write. And only one person after their first group said, I didn't get enough time to talk. And so I highlight this to say that 15 minutes of writing is certainly doable with this population. Again, these are all people with serious mental illness and mostly schizophrenia spectrum disorder diagnoses on both inpatient and outpatient settings. And the feedback we got was they wanted more time to write. So many people actually took their writing home with them and continued or expressed an interest in continuing to write and work on their narratives. And so I highlight this to say that the 15 minutes is really feasible. And this is unpublished data, but I think it's interesting and valuable, is that we also asked people during the group to complete the MARS, which is the Maryland Assessment of Recovery in Serious Mental Illness. We did an abbreviated scale of 12 items, and this looks at recovery-oriented beliefs. And what we found is that there was a statistically significant improvement in recovery-oriented beliefs in the outpatient setting, but not on the inpatient or when it was combined. Although when combined, we did see a pretty moderate effect size. So I mentioned this just to say that I thought it was interesting that the more groups people attended, it was associated with improvement in recovery-oriented beliefs. This is just 2 case examples from both the outpatient and inpatient setting of a male and a female in their 50s on the, or mid 50s on the outpatient setting, and 35 to 45 inpatient, but that you see over time that their recovery-oriented beliefs increase. And so again, these are just 2 case examples, but I thought it was valuable and interesting. And this was in the context of an augmentation to what they were already doing. So keeping that in mind as well, in terms of their treatment plan. I want to share with you also what our participants reported on the qualitative data and what they wrote in their own words. And so someone had written that these writing groups have been helpful. The writing group gives me a chance to focus on a topic, reflect, and write about the topic. It helps me focus, and it helps bring a clear picture to my mind. The group helps to bring more positive memories to my mind or lessen the effects of negative memories. Someone else said the group taught me something about myself. This group allowed me to look at myself from an objective point of view. I learned that I'm proud of myself. I didn't realize it before. I like this group and what I can express, and it keeps me in check, and I let my feelings and emotions out when I write. I thought it was helpful to include just how our participants viewed and described their participation in the group. It's still, I think, important to acknowledge that there's some limitations to this. It's a developing method. The feasibility data was collected as part of a program evaluation measure, not a rigorous study to test the efficacy or feasibility of merit as a group. So replication is needed with larger samples and from outside clinics and groups. We didn't directly measure metacognitive capacity in our initial pilot, so that would certainly be important. I think it's open debate of, is creative writing the best name for the group? We had folks interested in writing about more fictional pieces and getting feedback on their writing, and we had to do some work to reorient them to the goals of the group. And we also don't know what the ideal duration for writing and the discussion time is, what are the best writing prompts, and what are the active components of the group. So there's certainly a lot of room and work to be done in this domain. I want to leave you with just a couple thoughts about maybe next steps and some potentially active components that I think are really valuable to share with you. So I think it's possible that there are unique benefits to writing the personal narrative. So maybe that encoding or learning is different writing compared to just speaking about the narrative. And I also think that there's something about the self-stimulation of self-reflectivity through the writing prompt. And what I mean by that is that often we had participants say, I finished with 2 or 3 minutes to spare. And I started thinking, what else can I write about in this situation? Like, what details did I forget to include, or what else might someone want to know? And they're kind of organically prompting themselves to start to enrich these narratives and think about their experience in a way that might be different, or they're asking the questions that we might when we're talking about it one-on-one in a merit session. Also, the writing topics can extend someone's sense of who they are outside of a mental health diagnosis. So many of our participants talked about enjoying talking about what their first job was, or a time they helped someone, or they learned something new. And these might be aspects that they don't routinely stop and talk about in their psychiatric care, and certainly consistent with a merit one-on-one intervention as well, though. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the peer involvement plays a really unique role in enhancing the benefits of the merit intervention. They can learn about how others form narratives, experience the world, and respond to similar difficulties. It can serve as a model for maybe higher metacognitive capacity, and it can increase opportunities to learn about the mind of another. So in support of mind of other and decentration, for example, decrease feelings of isolation, and reduce stigma. So there's certainly something magical about having that peer component that I think is synergistic with the goals of merit, and really lends itself to enhancing the goals of merit. And the provider can observe and moderate clients' interactions with others in real time. And so we often are hearing about these interactions from our clients in an individual merit session without really knowing maybe objectively how it went, or, and I think there's value to the client's perspective, absolutely, but having both of those pieces of information can be really valuable, and being able to observe it in real time and intervene and talk about it with the client in real time can be really meaningful, and it gives the opportunity for other peers in real time also to give feedback to the clients. And so with that, I want to wrap up and say thank you, and I'll hand it over to Jackie to talk more about the real world application of merit.
Thank you. So I'm Jackie Abate. I work at Eskenazi in Indianapolis. I don't have slides, so I'll just be talking from my notes here, but I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience implementing the group at our community mental health center here. So I started the group several years ago as a student before the manual had come out, and tried doing that with having group members write on their own and then bring in the writing with them. This quickly didn't go very well. People would forget to bring in the writing or forget to do the writing, or if we had new group members, they didn't know the prompt from the week before, so doing some troubleshooting with that group. I then tried to do the group on internship at the Baltimore VA, and so that setting was a lot more structured, and you had to have like an outline for what each session would look like and a limit. So I had to make the writing group as like a six session group. And so in that case, I tried to pick out the 6 prompts that I thought might like elicit the most discussion about a range of things. But it did feel pretty quick to have it so limited like that. And so in this role that I'm in now in the Community Mental Health Center, I'm doing the writing group as an ongoing group. It's an open group, so people can join at any time. And this has been really helpful in just having a lot of different prompts, being able to have different people come in and out or give the group a try. And so Ashley was talking about the structure of the group. So how we do the group here at present is to start the group, if there are new group members, we'll do introductions and discuss the structure and expectations of the group. If there aren't any new group members, we'll just jump into the writing prompt, and I'll put that on the board. So since this is an ongoing group, I've been doing it for the last year about. And so I went through a lot of the prompts from the manual and some other ones. And so we've gotten now to repeating prompts, which I think is okay too, because people's responses might change even if they've done that same prompt before, like months earlier. Or we incorporate new prompts as they come up or as I think of them. The group members then spend 10 minutes writing and responding to the prompts. So I set a timer. 10 minutes has kind of just been what's worked for us. 15 minutes has been a little bit longer for people to tolerate. And sometimes 10 minutes feels a little long, but I do wait for that timer to go off, because even if everyone's done, like Ashley said, they might think of things they want to add or just kind of reflect on what the experience was like writing. So I do encourage them to wait or think more about their writing in that time. Then we briefly process what it was like to write about that topic, and then move into the discussion. So along with providing like the merit interventions and trying to respond to the person that's sharing, like Ashley said, peer feedback is a really important part of the group. And so I really try to encourage people to talk to each other, which was kind of difficult at first with people not knowing what to say when someone shared a prompt. And so we talked about thinking of like sharing what stood out to you, if someone's story reminded you of anything or what it made you think of, or also to ask clarifying questions to the person. So this helped get group members to talk to each other a lot more and give each other feedback. And then, like she said, we processed the experience of discussing that topic and how the group went. And then I hold on to people's responses. So I provide the journals for the group and hold on to them, because like in the first group experience, people would forget to bring them back or not do them. And so I've just held on to them in my office, which is kind of helpful because they have their notebook every week and then they can kind of look back on their writing. It's all in one place. If someone does want to take it with them, that is fine. I'll like make a copy and give it to them if they want to take the writing. So it's not to like keep it from them. And we've also had people who have opted to write in their own journals, and that's fine too. But just to make it easier, we try to have those on hand. So I'll talk about some of the challenges or questions I've encountered with the group and how I responded, and then some positive moments from the group that have just stuck out. So like Ashley mentioned with the creative writing group topic, there's sometimes a misperception that the group is for like aspiring fiction writers, and this is difficult to sometimes talk about if someone comes in wanting to write like a story or kind of help their career. And so I try to be clear that this is about stories from your own life. It's a therapy group, and so we're there to reflect upon our own experiences. At our clinic, we call the group the journal group, so that kind of gives it some idea that it's kind of like journaling, but that still happens, that people come in with that misperception. I do make it clear that they can write however is comfortable for them, whether that's free journaling or poetry or song lyrics, bullet points. However it makes sense to them, they're free to write in that way, but it does have to be self-reflective and about their life. It has come up about the group facilitator participating in the writing activity, so I kind of use my clinical judgment as far as which prompts I'll respond to and not. If it is a prompt that's more general or like not directly related to mental illness in some way, I might write about like a personal memory or something like that. Or if there's a lot fewer group members for some reason, there's not a lot of people to share, I might write in that way. But I wouldn't write for the activity if it is more like directly related to stigma or mental illness. And it's kind of like making the decision about self-disclosure in individual therapy. Like, am I doing it for the purpose of the group? Is this for my own reasons? What is this going to add to the group for me, writing and sharing? And I have had good experiences where I've written and shared, and I think it is helpful for the clients to see that you are a person and to learn about some of your personal experiences too, so it doesn't feel so one-sided. Have had group members either not wanting to share what they wrote or kind of paraphrasing and like summarizing what they've written rather than reading from the page. So it's been really rare that someone hasn't wanted to read what they wrote. I think if they're joining the group and they see other people sharing, they kind of get that expectation that what they write is what they share. And we also try and say, like, don't write something that you're not comfortable sharing. That way it's their decision to disclose what they want to. But pretty often I'll have people just summarizing what they wrote and not really feel like comfortable reading what they've written on the page. And so in those cases, after they do it a few times, we might talk about like why that is or encourage them to read from the page. But I think kind of getting into that difference between like telling a story verbally versus writing it down, there's like something different about the quality of those. And so I'm not sure the best way to handle that. But yeah, I don't force anyone to read it, but I encourage them to read from their writing as much as possible. Another thing that's come up is sometimes different mixes of clients and groups really would prefer to keep the content like light and not talk about mental illness or painful memories from their past. And so it kind of depends on the topic for that week and what the prompt is. And if we've had a week that has gotten to be very like painful or serious, then the next week we might be mindful to write about something that might feel a little bit lighter. But Ashley and I talked about this a little bit in thinking about like trauma as it relates to the group, where we don't really know what topics are going to bring up different memories for people. So I can try to be mindful of the heaviness, I guess, of the topic and what that might elicit. But again, we don't know what memories might come up for people and kind of just discuss those as they come. I've had other colleagues ask me if group members have ever picked what they wanted to write, and I thought this was a really good question. I have tried to give this opportunity to the clients and like elicit ideas from them, or just come in and say like, what would you like to write about today? But they do usually want some sort of guidance. I think as they're knowing what to expect from the group, it feels easier for them to just be given the topic and write about it. But I would like to have them more involved in creating prompts. And we have had times where a client has brought up a prompt and then in a few weeks we'll do that prompt and it's gone well. But yeah, I think that would be a good thing to do too, is have them involved in picking the writing topics based on what they'd like to talk about. And then the last thought that I had about as far as challenges was giving thinking about each client's metacognitive capacity and having different levels of like self-reflectivity or other reflectivity and how to navigate that in a group setting. In this specific group, it's kind of like having individual discussions with each person after they share. So it really is kind of focused on them sometimes. And so you would just tailor it, I think, at that point to whoever's sharing and what their metacognitive level might be. But as far as like the larger discussion, I think that can be a challenge, having people at different capacities in the same group. But I do think with the writing prompts, it can be really helpful for people with lower metacognitive abilities to hear from others with higher metacognition and kind of help them like model what a richer narrative might sound like, or to have someone with higher metacognition elicit feedback from that person and have them like think about maybe different details that they wouldn't think about on their own. So in that way, I do think the group can be helpful as far as peer feedback too, and helping with people's metacognitive levels. I wanted to share some writing prompts that went very successfully, some unexpected, but just some good moments that we've had. So this prompt was actually suggested by a client who wanted to write about a time when you got dressed up for something. So I thought that was a good way to elicit a narrative. I didn't really think much of it, but we had a really great discussion, and it gave glimpses into different milestones or important moments in different group members' lives that we might not have talked about otherwise. For example, a client talked about going to a high school prom and not having a lot of resources, and so this organization like donated her a dress, and she was able to have that experience. Or another client wrote about like a New Year's Eve party with old friends. So that was really nice to hear about. Recently, we had done the prompt, write about a time when you decided to tell someone about your mental illness, and follow up to that, like, why did you decide to tell them, or how did it go? And this led to a really good discussion about stigma and internalized stigma, and that was a pretty big group. I think we had like 8 people in the group, and so it was getting to the point where we only had about 10 minutes left, and only a few people had shared, and I hadn't encountered that before. And so we decided, like, you know what, rather than rushing these last few people to share their stories, why don't we carry this over to next week? And so we kind of had like a double group where we continued the conversation the next week, and the rest of the people got to share, and so had a longer discussion about stigma if it was a prompt that led to like a lively discussion, which is not all of them. Another time we wrote about, write about a time when you said goodbye to someone. This was when our student was leaving, and so it was kind of on topic. I think Ashley had mentioned doing this group as well, and it really took a turn and didn't go so well for her group. In ours, it led to a really good discussion about people kind of interpreted that prompt through the lens of like loss and death, or like disconnect with friends and family. And so even though that was a more painful group, it was a really rich discussion. Another interesting one that we did was write about a song that represents you or brings up a memory, or kind of similar, write about your favorite song and the story of the first time that you heard it. So in doing this, as each person shared, we listened to the song together and kind of talked about like what emotions and memories that was bringing up for different people. So that was a nice experience. And then lastly, this one is not a narrative. It's one of the only ones I have that doesn't elicit specifically a narrative episode, but we respond to the prompt, who are you? And then this kind of gets at like someone's idea of their identity, but then we redo that prompt like every 6 months or so and kind of look back on how that's changed over time. And so if someone has been there for the last time they did the prompt, they'll read like both of them and kind of discuss those. So one of the clients from the current group that I'm doing did give consent to share some of her writing for the purpose of this talk. So we thought that might be interesting to share some of the prompts that she's responded to. So just to give like a little bit of general background, this is a African-American female in her 20s. She's been part of the group from the beginning, about a year ago. She has a very young daughter who was taken away by DCS and lives with an older sibling. And she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but she does have mixed feelings about this label and her experience of whatever she was going through being described as a mental illness. So I'll share a couple of her writing. I'll share the first one just reading it, but we also thought it would be interesting to maybe kind of stimulate the group in this discussion by sharing some of her writing and then having you all think about like how you might respond to her or what questions or reflections you might have based on the writing. So keep that in mind as I'm reading them, but I'll share like 3 and then maybe we can open it up for discussion. They're not very long. So the first one, the prompt was write about a memory of your first friend. So she wrote, the first friend that I remember having was a girl named Name. I can remember the fact that I never knew exactly how to spell her name. I was never told. I met her around the age of 6 or 7. She and I met in a different state. Her parent was in the military for the United States as well as my mother, so we all lived on a military base. One night, between the ages of 6 and 8, she and I decided to go far away from home. I remember we ended up in a police station that night, and at least one of our parents appeared at the police station after we had been there. So that was what she wrote about her first friend. So then we would open it up to the group and might reflect on her thoughts about this event. People might ask questions to learn more about it. Might ask about the event from her friend's point of view or the parent's point of view to kind of stimulate more metacognitive reflection depending on where she's at. This person does seem to have a good sense of her cognitive operations, but not really emotions. So I would probably for her focus on that, like how did she feel about this? What was she thinking or feeling when her parents showed up? Might open it up to the group, like has anyone else had an experience like this with a friend, or what does this make them think of? This next one, the prompt was write about a fall memory. It was turning to October, so we just decided to write about fall in this week. And she wrote, every time October hits, I think of my life ending at the end of the month. Like I think my life will end on Halloween or the day after, because I've read about the Halloween day being named something like Devil's Night from its origin in Detroit, Michigan somewhere. So almost the whole beginning of fall, I worry, and it starts whenever I see the candy in bulk at the store. The worry begins. I think it's because I believe or think that the devil, Satan, wants to ruin lives, and that's just how it was transformed into this spiritual monster since being banned from heaven. Fall reminds me of my niece. She was born November 16th. November 16th is a date in the season of autumn, so yeah, she's like the positive highlight of my fall. My youngest brother was born on the 20th of September. So for this one, the group had a lot of questions about her thoughts about her life ending Halloween night, why she thought that, where she got this idea, how other people in the group didn't share that thought. I also kind of reflected on how the tone of her writing changed from the thoughts about her life ending or the world ending on Halloween to the positive memories of her family members being born and how that switch happened. So yeah, a lot of discussion about this one. And then I'll read this one here, and then maybe we can open it up to the group for thoughts on how you might respond to this or what you might reflect for her. So this was her response to the prompt, write about a time when you said goodbye to someone. She wrote, I love you so much, but I just can't anymore. I've given you a lot. Now I am poor We have a lot in store for our new world that we'll explore, expressing my feelings to you with something you adored, but now I'm going to close the door. So there have been many occasions in which I've had to say goodbye, and in the act, I have been emotional in different ways. Sometimes when I have to say goodbye, I am excited, happy, and exhausted. When I feel excited and happy about giving a goodbye, it is because I am exhausted from the event that occurred. The poem above is about saying goodbye to a stranger, internally and mentally, because I'm forced to with pressure from the spiritual world. The pressure from the spiritual world is there because I feel it's wrong to be in the relationship. So I'm curious if this was shared in a group, what are people's thoughts on how you might respond, what questions or reflections you would have?
I guess on the last one, it seemed as though it was not rooted in a specific, at least the bulk of it wasn't rooted in a specific memory. And then she kind of shifted into a general reference to multiple goodbyes. I guess my thought would be to try to prompt her into pulling in some more specific narrative material in from the end of it. And I don't know if she was able to do that, but.
Yeah, definitely asking her to try and like maybe give an example of one of these times when she said goodbye. Yes, and so in the group when she shared that, it seemed like the goodbyes were very like painful memories, and it seemed like that's why she kind of shifted into sharing more like general things rather than getting specifically into one of those painful memories. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I agree that.
Good,
Sorry.
good.
I was just gonna say, I agree that it struck me as kind of different from the other ones from the same person, and that I like. So I think I would start with more like process questions of like, what was that like for you to write, and what kinds of things did that bring up for you, kind of generally.
I'm sort of compelled by the first example of ending up in a strange place, sort of sounding like a scene from Jesus's Son. And I think it could be difficult to connect that to other narrative episodes, but I might wonder more about that narrative episode, about the day before or the day after, and just being able to think about a sequence of events in which there's something that can be understood rather than this sort of mad force that's just tumbling forward into chaos.
Yeah, those are good thoughts. And I think with having a different topic each week, it does seem like a lot of the narrative can just be kind of separate points in time without really being connected. So I think that's the good thing too about having someone who maybe comes to group pretty regularly. You can try and help connect those stories as well.
I mean, I'm also struck how difficult it is to sort of distinguish a narrative from a statement of beliefs or something one anticipates. The Halloween stuff is a statement of what someone anticipates. It's not a story. And I think it may be difficult for them to distinguish, just as even a mental operation, what it means to anticipate something versus to recollect a sequence of things that have happened.
Kind of along the lines of what you were talking about, Jackie, of sort of having the same people come to a group consistently, and that you have like these different data points to kind of reflect back on with them. I think one thing I was thinking about with this, the last example being so different, and something that I might do in like individual therapy, if someone's had a narrative that seemed different from other ones that they've told or something like that, I might just notice that like the way that they told this story seemed different from some of their other ones, and see if they had any reflections or thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And even within this narrative, there was like a poem and like her voice. So even connecting those or noticing that those were different too. Yeah, well, thank you for letting me share some of those. That was all I had for my piece of the presentation. So I think now we'd like to open it up for maybe general questions or discussion about the group.
I guess I was thinking a little bit about, you know, where people were coming into this group in terms of their metacognitive ability. I know, Ashley, you said on your study you didn't have that, but just kind of a general sense of where people are and whether or not you think there's some kind of floor. You know, is there some sort of requisite level of metacognitive ability to be able to get something out of this? We certainly don't argue that for individual therapy, but I guess I'm curious what your experience has been, both of you, for people coming in with really low metacognition.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think that's a fantastic question. We've had folks, I want to say, across the spectrum since we looked at both inpatient and outpatient, like a day program, do the group. And so we've really seen, I think, across the board in terms of metacognition or metacognitive capacity. And I think some folks have struggled to write. Maybe they don't write for the full time. They write a couple bullets, but maybe it takes time to get comfortable in writing for that long. I will say we've had folks that were really struggling to make sense of what was happening in their mind, pretty low metacognition, and floridly psychotic on the inpatient unit, who have written beautiful narratives that were so meaningful with insights about their life that were really astounding. Actually, I'm thinking of someone who was an older gentleman who thought that he was like a celebrity in multiple movies and this famous individual. And when we wrote about his first job, and he talked about delivering newspapers and how getting a couple quarters was so meaningful and what he would do with that money and how valuable it was to contribute to his family. And there was such insight about his life in that. So even people who typically might struggle have really taken to either talking about the narrative and or writing. So I think it really is been kind of a range of responses, but I think just like individual interventions, we can really meet someone where they're at and incorporate them into the group in a meaningful way. I'm not sure, Jackie, what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the people that I've had come to group who did seem to have very low levels of self-reflectivity really benefited from hearing other people share their narratives or just get asked questions, because their narratives were pretty like barren at first, maybe just a few sentences, but have seen that improve. One person comes to mind who specifically was very like disorganized and really just struggled to create a narrative in general. And I think that can be difficult if someone is writing a lot, like the third writing I shared, it's more like general or abstract, and they really can't tell a story. So this person, I just continued to, after she shared, I just continued to try and get at that narrative, like give me a specific time for this. And she eventually did share like piece fragments of narratives through the disorganized speech, but I think that has been a struggle if someone has trouble writing about a moment in their life in general.
Also, as you were talking, Jackie, it reminded me that I've also seen where peers have given feedback. So metacognitive capacity can really ebb and flow, right? So we've had folks that maybe gave more barren narratives or had trouble describing their particular experience, and then one day wrote a really elaborate narrative that was pretty enriched, and their peers have said, wow, I learned a lot from you today. Like that's really different from previous, weeks. And so that peer feedback also seems to be so salient and powerful. And I think the peers are really good at giving that kind of feedback in addition to what we might add, but it just seems so valuable coming from others in the group too. So I think I might have, interrupted.
Can I jump in with a few comments? Yeah. So thank you very much, Ashley and Jackie, such an important work and inspiring presentation, and it's very impressive and insightful. I wrote few comments, but I first want to comment on your question and your reply to Jay, because I was listening to the way you phrased the question, and I was wondering, because in other groups you asked if people should have a minimum level, if I got it right, of metacognition, right? And usually we check if people have like when we do NECT, then we want people to struggle with self-stigma in order to get in the group. So I wonder about the direction of the question, because maybe we want people with deficits in metacognition in order to get in the group and help them. I mean, that it depends on the perspective that we look at this, because we want to help people with what they struggle with. So that might be the reason to include those people. But it's just some thought that I had. One major thought that I had listening to you both is about the balance between the writing and the discussion. And we think about merit as an intersubjective process that takes place, and one can engage with others, either real others or imaginative one, but in order to stimulate reflective abilities. And I was wondering what's going on while writing. Someone is, you can imagine the other, you can think about the other, but there is no actual exchange. So I was wondering about this. I also thought about, I was thinking about the open group format you mentioned, Jackie, and I was thinking if it is suitable to add to in an inpatient format, because usually it's open groups. We just finished the inpatient trial in Israel with impressive, great result, which I will be happy to share in a different occasion. And I think that one way to continue the project there in a cost-effective way will be to do groups. So I was wondering about this, because people come to hospitalization in different phases of illness, so it might be more challenging than an open group in your setting. Just another thought. And last thing is, you mentioned, Ashley, the people own words giving you feedback on the group. So just the suggestion, we developed an instrument, an open-ended interview that we use assessing different psychosocial interventions, and the Dutch trial of merit used it for merit, and we now analyze data from the Israel trial. So you might consider using it so we can have the same interview to assess merit in different contexts, and we can then will be more standardized how we look at themes. And maybe last thing, there is a SPR conference in June in Dublin. I don't know if you guys, US people, want to come to Dublin in June. SPR is the Society of Psychotherapy Research. It's very good conferences. I highly recommend. And if someone is interested, so please write to me. We'll make a panel or something together. Thank you. Sorry if I was too much space.
Thank you. Those were some really great questions and interesting idea. I absolutely love the idea of the interview to look at the psychosocial interventions, and I'll certainly look into that, because I think it would be wonderful to look at merit across different types of interventions. So I was trying to keep track. I think one of the questions was thinking about the mind of the other, and when someone's writing, maybe it doesn't have that immediate exchange. And I think that's true. In many of the cases, it is more about the individual's experience, although they get that feedback from others, maybe how they might have responded in that situation, or asking about what others thought. And I have at times offered to some folks who've done the group, or maybe feel like, oh, I don't want to write about this topic again, because sometimes we will repeat topics, just like, individual merit, where you can see a narrative become more and more enriched, we will sometimes revisit things. And I've offered to others to write from the perspective of someone else that's in the group or in that experience. So it has them maybe thinking more concretely about what that other person's experience of that event might have been like. So maybe if they got, writing, thinking about the examples Jackie shared about that first friend. Well, maybe you write about it from what that friend's experience was like when you first met. So you're really actively engaging with the mind of the other in a different way. So that's one way we've tried to tackle that in writing, but I think that's a great point, that maybe that's not always the case. And the other question was about the inpatient unit. And I wanted to highlight that the trial that we did on feasibility did have 6 groups from the inpatient unit, with some participants that actually carried over into the outpatient setting, who came back in the outpatient setting. And it was really unique and interesting to see the narrative change and the metacognitive levels change from inpatient to an outpatient setting. But it was certainly something that we saw as feasible, at least in the handful of cases that we saw transition between those 2 facilities. So I think it's something that could be done in both an open group, and I think there could be value in thinking about it as a cohort as well, so people really get to know one another. And I've seen kind of participants in some way hold each other accountable. So maybe someone wrote about feeling like they couldn't learn something new, or they struggled at work, and someone said, hey, you've already written about this 3 times, that you helped someone, or you developed this new task at work, and hey, that's not really true. But hearing it from peers, I think, again, is really synergistic with what we do in Merit. So I hope that answers some of the questions.
Yeah, and as far as the open format on an inpatient unit, I think like there is a benefit outpatient to having the same group members come each time, so they get comfortable with each other and get to know each other. But I do think this group would be excellent for an inpatient unit, because I think also there are a lot of benefits to writing, and I think there's something different about sharing your story and talking to someone versus like writing it and thinking independently and just having a different medium. And so thinking about like where people are when they're on an inpatient unit, if they're feeling like guarded or confused or kind of working through something, I think writing could be really great for that experience.
I had a straight thought about this idea of intersubjectivity in writing. I mean, I think I ran our writing group years ago in the prison system, and the group members there usually did not have histories of psychosis, but trauma, severe depression, personality disorder were main presenting issues. But one thing in thinking back on it is that as group members kept coming back week after week, clearly who the audience was in their writing evolved, and they started incorporating other people's from the group, including my own, but their other peers, as an intended audience. And I do think there's something that's quite intersubjective about this kind of writing when it's intended to be shared. So I think that in some ways it serves, I would think, as sort of almost like a jump start on it, relative to just like a general process group where people might be quite threatened by just spontaneously sharing. I know.
I guess I had a similar thought and question. I recently did written exposure therapy with a patient for PTSD. So she didn't have psychosis, but something that she shared during our termination session was that it felt like there was something different about the process of writing that allowed her to reflect on her experience in a way that she wasn't quite able to do in traditional kind of talk therapy. And I've been thinking since then about like, how do we kind of emulate some of, I think it was Ashley said, there's like some magic that that happens in writing. And are there any ways that we can also like bring that into our individual therapy work with Merit? Like, how do we kind of emulate the process that happens in writing that allows people to kind of organize their thoughts in a different way?
I mean, that calls to mind, there's a section in the Paul Auster book, Travels in the Scriptorium, which is really about sort of a mind moving from just sheer fragmentation to more complex accounts. And one of the central things is the guy starts reading. And then after he starts reading, the book ends and it doesn't tell him what happened. So he has to then create something. But I mean, I think when people write, they engage in some sort of imaginal process, but there is also necessarily, as Jay pointed out, the audience. And I mean, it seems like one key thing that's so tricky for us to do in individual work in merit is with the person with severe centralities, how would someone else in the world see this? And in these group activities, there's continuous possibility to wonder what someone else has seen. And I feel like, I wonder, one of the key interventions that goes on when actually you're doing it, or Jackie, you're doing it, is you're saying, it seems as if so-and-so has an idea, and you're continuously introducing, not that they have a different perspective than yours, but that there's a different person in the center of this world with them who's seeing and thinking. And I appreciate, I mean, the enormous amount of work it takes to just get this small little thing established, which is this group in this format, which perhaps doesn't seem so small as you guys do it. But I feel like it opens the door for something that's been so lacking for in our own work for so many years here. We're largely people who love individual therapy, so that's what we've pursued. But clearly one thing that we've never touched on is family therapy. And I'm wondering to what extent this represents, or it opens another set of gates, to which the open dialogue people have been inhabiting for ages now, but some sort of sharing of stories with families. And I know that in Israel, and the NECT has been adapted for families. So, I mean, I'm wondering if that's in the cards somewhere as well, as we're looking for more and more ways to help people create stories, think about them, understand how others think about them, and be connected to human beings in that process.
We had two of married patients in the outpatient trial we did. There wasn't any systematic work with families, but we needed to, because one just came with his partner, and another patient, we really needed to engage our parents. So we did few sessions, including family members. So we can look at these examples and think about guidelines for this. But it wasn't anything systematic. It wasn't bottom up. We had the situation and we coped with it. It's interesting to think about it. Me, I have problem with the, sorry. Now you hear me better? Yeah, okay. So I just mentioned briefly, we had in the outpatient trial, we completed already. We didn't do anything systematically engaging family members, but we did have two patients that we needed to do some family work. One was just coming with his partner, and it was obvious that we need to address some issues there. And another patient, it was clear that we need to engage her parents due to dependence issue. And so we did few sessions with family members, but it wasn't any systematic ways.
I mean, one thing that's nice about this format that actually you've really perfected is that it really gets people to tell a story, and we move away from abstractions and education. I mean, I don't know what if this is I don't know if this is your experience or not, but my feeling is that if we give this group to someone who's who's sort of merit naive, whatever that means, it's just going to be the same shit. It's going to, I guess this is being recorded, so strike that word, Reed. But it's the same thing where we're going to be teaching people and we're going to be challenging the weird things they think and saying, hey, here's a different way to look at it. Why don't you try this? And this really has the discipline of, let's just tell a story. And the story is just a sequence. Let's think of a sequence of events which surround you and take place at a particular point in time. And I wonder if that opens the door for us to be able to explore metacognition in broader social contexts. And not to go crazy on all this, but I wonder if it gets us more into thinking about the social processes ourselves, which we want to be more infused in our work spaces and our larger community spaces where human beings relate to each other, and actually think about things in metacognitive capacity is supported between people.
I mean, to that point, both Ashley and Jackie mentioned stigma, and it seems to me quite clearly to be a stronger way to approach anti-stigma, to have people tell stories and then demonstrate that their stories are valuable and are not, go beyond just signs and symptoms of illness, rather than the first 3 sessions of this group being explaining to them how recovery can happen and that, et cetera. But to me, that seems like a key desirable part of this group.
Yeah, and as far as like the social processes too, I think like obviously this group is about writing and telling a narrative, but there's also another task in the peer feedback and social part of it where people are expected to share their narrative, but they're also expected to be curious about other people and ask other people questions or listen and be attentive to other people, which I think might be new or challenging just as much as writing a narrative could be.
I think that's really true, Jackie. And Jay, to get back to your point too, I was thinking that when someone's talking about these other aspects of their life and really telling the story of who they are, it does more organically come up about symptoms of mental health and the struggles that they've experienced, but in a really organic way of how it's interrupting their life. And that really makes it tangible, I think, for the group to intervene and talk about that in a very real way than just going through what the signs and symptoms of psychosis, like some of the other groups might orient towards. So I think for some that's been a really meaningful experience and thinking about how it impacts their life more directly, but getting at it through these kind of maybe more neutral prompts, if you will.
Do you think it would make sense or be appropriate to have a short writing segment in just like in a one-on-one session where you sit for 5 minutes and have them write and then talk about it?
I think that certainly would be doable and feasible. And I have to say a lot of the folks in some of these groups have looked for that in individual work, because I've worked with some of them after the group and they've brought in written narratives that they've done on their own and said, like, I want to talk about this. I wrote this after a group where I was just thinking about this interaction. So I wrote it down. Can we talk about it? Or they'll give it to me and say, let's talk about this in an hour. And I get homework to read it. But it leads to such meaningful discussion. So it's just maybe a different avenue to talk about a narrative that maybe they weren't comfortable sharing, or maybe it gave them a block of time to really sit and think carefully about what their experience was like, that maybe just talking in a one-on-one session doesn't offer. So there was something really unique to bringing that into individual work. So I think it certainly would be doable and feasible in individual work for sure.
I've had individual clients where it's come up organically, where they've just brought stuff into, that they've written outside of session. That's been more common for me. And usually it has similar, positive role in it, but it's something that is sort of been their idea.
I feel like what we want. Go ahead.
Sorry. I think something I struggle with the group is like setting the topic, and that's why I said I would like to have clients input on what they'd like to talk about. So I think if it's their idea or they're bringing it up, it'd be different than us as an individual therapist saying, like, write about this today.
I'm still struck that what you guys do that keeps this merit is that experience is still open to reflection, and it doesn't get transformed into this thing which is impervious to reflection. As soon as it becomes a symptom and psychoeducation comes into play, or there's a particular intervention you're supposed to do to fix it, it's no longer something to think about. And thought shuts down. And activities that enable thought seem Like it makes a lot of sense. I mean, Sarah, you mentioned like what would it mean to do some writing about of a life experience, and I feel like if it's prescribed, you run the risk of that sort of subtle change in which experience no longer is your own and something you're exploring or thinking about. But if there's this sort of magic, it's that you can have a different understanding and you can be something different.
I think even in addition to just narratives in general and like writing narratives, I have a client with an intellectual disability and autism, and he has a really hard time like processing my questions sometimes, and he like needs a lot of additional time to really think about things. And so one thing he's done is he also writes narratives, and we'll bring those in, but sometimes I'll ask like, what was your reaction to me sharing that? Or what are your thoughts on our session today? And he like really has a hard time doing that in the moment. And so when he is able to then go home and sort of have an amount of time to think about it, he'll even write those things down and write his reactions down or answers to questions that he wasn't able to do in the moment. And so I think that's been really helpful too, to incorporate writing into individual sessions.
Another question popped into my head. I'm wondering about whether the two of you think that it's important that everyone have the same prompt every week. You both mentioned, well, at least Jackie, you mentioned the one where it like prompted a pretty rich discussion because of the shared themes across. But I guess I'm wondering if had you considered like, here are a list of prompts, here are 3 different prompts, choose the one, like choose your own adventure kind of thing, or?
It's a really interesting idea. I think it could really also lead to some dynamic discussions. I think that's certainly one aspect of the group for future directions, is to think about ideal prompts and should we offer multiple, and what are the benefits of that versus sticking to one. I think that's a really interesting question. That it could work really well, and might also depend on the group. Because I think shifting between the 2 different discussions might be challenging for some. I think maybe that helps when it's all one maybe theme that you can make reflections about how people relate or experience, or have a range of different experiences around one type of topic. And so I think there's also value in that, but I can also see that multiple prompts would probably lead to a rich discussion as well. So it might be worth piloting and seeing how it goes. And Kelsey, when you were talking, sorry, go ahead, Paul. I was just going to add that I really appreciated Kelsey's reflection about the client that she worked with, and it had reminded me of one of the questions I have about how Merit as a group was working. Is I really think about how someone is learning, and I wonder if writing leads to some type of more salience of the narratives, or does it help at all for someone to hang on to the progress or the gains from thinking about their narrative when they write it out and then also talk about it? And I feel like for me, those are a lot of open questions, but I'm curious if there's something different about the learning aspect that goes on from just talking versus writing and talking about the narrative, if that's different for some people or not.
One thing that Courtney and I have been thinking about and trying to write some about is that, so it's that you get better at evolving narratives, so that it isn't that you get the right story or the right theme. I mean, you when we avoid slipping back into, you have a concrete thing that you hold on to, but then you get better at being a storyteller about your life, and that those stories are responsive to what's happening in the world. I mean, I feel like, this is the whole problem also with the usual goal crap that we get, which is, all right, your goal is to get to Purdue, but then you get there and you don't know what to do, or your goal is to get a date, or your goal is to do X, your goal is to take your medicine, but then what do you do? And I feel like this is an evolving set of responses to the world that people are getting better at. And it's no surprise, because people do writing groups all over the world. There are all sorts of people without any sort of mental illness who do writing groups. And to Jay's question, they don't have the same prompt, but they just write and think together. Well, it does look like we've come up really nicely against the 11:30 time. Listen, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. It was really inspiring to hear about all the careful work that's gone into thinking about this in complete parallel process. So I really appreciate this. We'll be in touch with the scheduling for the next Merit quarterly meeting, and really appreciate the presenters and all of your good comments and thoughts.